Magellan on board his caravel. Magellan on board his caravel. From an old print. On his return to Portugal, Magellan obtained leave, though not without difficulty, to search through the royal archives. He soon became certain that the Moluccas were situated in the hemisphere which the Bull of Demarcation, adopted at Tordesillas by the kings of Spain and Portugal, and confirmed in 1494 by Pope Alexander Roman VI, had given to Spain. In virtue of this line of demarcation, which was destined to give rise to so many impassioned debates, all the countries situated at 360 miles west of the meridian of the Cape de Verde Islands were to belong to Spain, and all those lying to the east of the same meridian to Portugal. Magellan was of too active a nature to remain long without again taking service. He went next to fight in Africa at Azama, a town in Morocco, where he received a slight wound in his knee, but one which, by injuring a nerve, made him lame for the remainder of his life, and obliged him to return to Portugal. Conscious of the superiority which his theoretical and practical knowledge and his services had earned for him above the herd of courtiers, Magellan naturally felt more keenly than another would have done the unjust treatment he received from Emmanuel with regard to certain complaints laid by the people of Azama against the Portuguese officers. King Emmanuel's prejudices soon changed to a real dislike. It showed itself by the outrageous imputation that Magellan was pretending to suffer from a wound which was really of no consequence and was completely cured, that he might escape from accusations which he could not refute. Such an assertion was a serious matter for the honor of Magellan, so susceptible and suspicious. He thereupon came to a desperate determination which corresponded, moreover, with the greatness of the insult which he had received. That no one might be ignorant of it, he caused it to be legally set forth that he renounced his rights as a Portuguese citizen and changed his nationality, and he then took out letters of naturalization in Spain. This was to proclaim, as solemnly as could possibly be done, that he intended to be looked upon as a subject of the Crown of Castile, to which henceforward he would consecrate his services and his whole life. This was a serious determination, as we can see, which no one blamed, and which even the most severe historians, such as Barros and Feria y Sousa, have excused. At the same time as Magellan, the licentiate Rey Falero left Lisbon with his brother Francisco and a merchant named Cristovam de Haro. The former was a man deeply versed in cosmographical knowledge, and had equally with Magellan fallen under Emmanuel's displeasure. Falero had entered into a treaty of partnership with Magellan to reach the Moluccas by a new way, but one which was not otherwise specified, and which remained Magellan's secret. As soon as they arrived in Spain, 1517, the two partners submitted their project to Charles V, who accepted it in principle, but there remained the always delicate question touching the means for putting it into execution. Happily, Magellan found in Juan de Aranda, the factor of the Chamber of Commerce, an enthusiastic partisan of his theories, and one who promised to exert all his influence to make the enterprise a success. He had an interview accordingly with the High Chancellor, the Cardinal and Bishop of Burgos, Fonseca. He set forth with such skill the great advantage that Spain would derive from the discovery of a route leading to the very center of the spice production, and the great prejudice which it would cause to the trade of Portugal, that an agreement was signed on the 22nd of March, 1518. The emperor undertook to pay all the expenses of the expedition on condition that the greater part of the profits should belong to him. But Magellan had still many obstacles to surmount before taking to the sea. In the first place, there were the remonstrances of the Portuguese ambassador, Alvaro de Costa, who, seeing that his endeavors were in vain, even tried to compass the assassination of Magellan, so says Feria y Sousa. Then he encountered the ill will of the employees of the Casa de Contratación at Seville, who were jealous of a stranger being entrusted with the command of such an important expedition, and envious of the least token of favor which had been accorded to Magellan and Rey Falero, who had been named commanders of the Order of St. James. But Charles V had given his consent by a public act, which seemed to be irrevocable. They tried, however, to make the emperor alter his decision by organizing, on the 22nd of October, 1518, a disturbance paid for with Portuguese gold. It broke out on the pretext that Magellan, who had just had one of his ships drawn on shore for repairs and painting, had decorated it with the Portuguese arms. This last attempt failed miserably, and 3 statutes of the 30th of March, 10th of April, fixed the composition of the cruise and named the staff, while a final official document dated from Barcelona, the 26th of July, 1519, confided the sole command of the expedition to Magellan. What had meanwhile been happening to Rey Falero, we cannot exactly say, but this man, who had up to this time been treated on the same footing as Magellan, and who had perhaps first conceived the project, now found himself quite excluded from the command of the expedition, after some dissensions of which the cause is unknown. His health already shaken, received a last shock from this affront, and poor Rey Falero, who had become almost childish, having returned to Portugal to see his family, was arrested there and only released upon the intercession of Charles V at last. After having sworn fidelity and homage to the crown of Castile, Magellan received in his turn the oath of his officers and sailors, and left the port of San Lucar de Barrameda on the morning of the 10th of August, 1519. But before entering on the narrative of this memorable campaign, we must give a few particulars of the man who has left us the most complete account of it, Francesco Antonio Pigafetta, or Jerome Pigafetta, as he is often called in France. Born at Venice about 1491, of a noble family, Pigafetta formed part of the suite of the ambassador Francesco Chiricalco, sent by Leo X to Charles V, who was then at Barcelona. His attention was no doubt aroused by the noise which the preparations for the expedition made at that time in Spain, and he obtained permission to take part in the voyage. This volunteer proved an excellent recruit, for he showed himself in every respect as faithful and intelligent an observer as he was a brave and courageous companion. He was wounded at the Battle of Zebu, fighting beside Magellan, which prevented him from being present at the banquet during which so many of his companions were destined to lose their lives. As to his narrative, with the exception of some exaggerations of detail according to the taste of that time, it is exact, and the greater part of the descriptions which we owe to him have been verified by modern travelers and learned men, especially by M. Alcide d'Orbigny. Upon his return to San Lucar on the 6th of September, 1522, after having fulfilled the vow which he had made to go barefoot to return, thanks to Nuestra Senora de la Victoria, the Lombard, as they called him on board the Victoria, presented to Charles V. Then at Valladolid, a complete journal of the voyage. When he returned to Italy, by means of the original as well as of some supplementary notes, he wrote a longer narrative of the expedition at the request of Pope Clement Roman VII, and of Villiers de L'Isle Adam, Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. He sent copies of this work to several distinguished personages, and notably to Louisa of Savoy, mother of Francis I. But she not understanding, so thinks Harris, the very learned author of the Bibliotheca Americana Vetustissima, the kind of patois used by Pigafetta, and which resembles a mixture of Italian, Venetian, and Spanish, employed a certain Jacques-Antoine Faber to translate it into French. Instead of giving a faithful translation, Faber made a kind of abridgment of it. Some critics, however, suppose that this narrative must have been written originally in French. They found their opinion upon the existence of 3 French manuscripts of the 16th century, which give very different readings, and of which 2 are deposited in the Bibliothèque Nationale at Paris. Pigafetta died at Venice about 1534, in a house in the Rue de la Lune, which in 1800 was still to be seen, and which bore the well-known device, "No rose without a thorn." At the same time, not wishing to confine ourselves to Pigafetta's narrative entirely, we have compared and completed it with that of Maximilian Transylvain, secretary to Charles V, of which there is an Italian translation in Ramusio's valuable collection. The fleet of Magellan consisted of the Trinidad of 120 tons burden, which carried the flag of the commander of the expedition, the Sant Antonio, also of 120 tons, commanded by Juan de Cartagena, the second in rank, the person joined with Magellan, says the official document, the Conception of 90 tons, commanded by Gaspar de Quesada, the famous Victoria of 85 tons, commanded by Luis de Mendoza, and lastly the Santiago of 75 tons, commanded by Joe Serrao, called by the Spaniards Serrano. 4 of these captains, and nearly all the pilots, were Portuguese. Barbosa and Gomez on board the Trinidad, Luis Alfonso de Goes and Vasco Galigo on the Victoria, Serrao, Joe Lopez de Carvalho on the Conception, Joe Rodriguez de Mofrupel on the Sant Antonio, and Joe Serrao on the Santiago, with 25 sailors, formed a total of 33 Portuguese out of the whole body of 237 individuals whose names have all been handed down to us, and amongst whom are found a considerable number of Frenchmen. Of the officers whose names have been mentioned, it is to be remembered that Duarte Barbosa was brother-in-law to Magellan, and that Estevam Gomez, who, by returning to Seville on the 6th of May, 1521, did not participate in the conclusion of this memorable voyage, was afterwards sent by Charles V to seek for the Northwest Passage, and in 1524 sailed along the coast of America from Florida to Rhode Island, and perhaps as far as Cape Cod. Nothing could have been better arranged than this expedition, for the equipment of which the whole resources of the nautical science of that epoch had been taxed. At the moment of departure, Magellan gave his last orders to his pilots and captains, and the code of signals which were to ensure unanimity in maneuvers and prevent a possible separation. On Monday morning, the 10th of August, 1519, the fleet weighed anchor and sailed down the Guadalquivir as far as San Lucar de Barrameda, which forms the port of Seville, where the victualling of the ships was completed, and it was the 20th of September before they were really off. 6 days afterwards, the fleet anchored at Tenerife in the Canary Archipelago, where both wood and water were taken on board. It was on leaving this island that the first symptoms appeared of the misunderstanding between Magellan and Juan de Cartagena, which was to prove so fatal to the expedition. The latter claimed to be informed by the commander-in-chief of the route which he intended to take, a claim which was at once rejected by Magellan, who declared that he was not called upon to give any explanation to his subordinate. After having passed between the Cape de Verde Islands and Africa, the ships reached the shores of Sierra Leone, where contrary winds and dead calms detained the fleet for 20 days. Juan de Cartagena placed in the stocks. Juan de Cartagena placed in the stocks. A painful incident now occurred. During a council which was held on board the flagship, a sharp dispute arose, and Juan de Cartagena, who affected to treat the captain general with contempt, having answered him with pride and insolence, Magellan felt obliged to arrest him with his own hand, and to have him put in the stocks, an instrument made of 2 pieces of wood, placed one upon the other and pierced with holes, in which were placed the legs of the sailor who was to be punished. The other captains remonstrated loudly with Magellan against a punishment which was too degrading for a superior officer, and Cartagena in consequence was simply put under arrest and guarded by one of the captains. To the calms now succeeded rain, tempests, and heavy squalls, which obliged the vessels to lie to. During these storms, the navigators several times witnessed an electric phenomenon of which the cause was not then known, but which they considered an undoubted sign of the protection of heaven, and which even at the present day is known by the name of St. Elmo's fire. Once past the equinoctial line, a passage which does not at that time seem to have been celebrated by the grotesque ceremony of baptism which is in vogue at the present day, they steered for Brazil, where on the 13th of December, 1519, the fleet cast anchor in the magnificent port of Santa Lucia, now known under the name of Rio Janeiro. This was not, however, the first time that this bay had been seen by Europeans, as was long believed. Since the year 1511, it had been known under the name of Bahia do Cabo Frio. It had been visited also, 4 years before Magellan's arrival, by Piero Lopez, and seems to have been frequented since the commencement of the 16th century by mariners from Deep Who, inheritors of the passion for adventurous navigation of their ancestors, the Northmen, roamed over the world and founded small establishments or factories in all directions. Here the Spanish expedition procured cheaply, in exchange for looking-glasses, pieces of ribbon, scissors, hawk's bells, or fish hooks, a quantity of provisions, amongst which Pigafetta mentions pineapples, sugar canes, sweet potatoes, fowls, and the flesh of the anta, which is thought to be the tapir. The account given in the same narrative of the manners of the inhabitants is sufficiently curious to be repeated. The Brazilians are not Christians, he says, but no more are they idolaters, for they worship nothing. Natural instinct is their only law. This is an interesting fact, and a singular avowal for an Italian of the 16th century, deeply imbued with superstition. It offers one more proof that the idea of the divinity is not innate, as some theologians have imagined. These natives live to a great age. They go entirely naked and sleep in cotton nets called hammocks, suspended by the two ends to beams. As to their boats, called canoes, each is hollowed out of the single trunk of a tree and can hold as many as 40 men. They are anthropophagi, cannibals, but only on special occasions, and scarcely ever eat any but their enemies taken in battle. Their dress of ceremony is a kind of vest made of parraquets feathers, woven together, and so arranged that the large wing and tail feathers form a sort of girdle round their loins, which gives them a whimsical and ridiculous appearance. We have already said that the feather cloak was in use on the shores of the Pacific. Among the Peruvians, it is curious to ascertain that it was worn equally by the Brazilians. Some specimens of this singular garment may be seen at the exhibition of the Ethnographical Museum. This was not, however, the only ornament of these savages. They suspended little stone cylinders from 3 holes pierced in the lower lip, a custom which is common among many of the oceanic people, and which may be compared with our fashion of ear-rings. These people were extremely credulous and of good disposition, and thus, as Pigafetta says, they could easily have been converted to Christianity, for they assisted in silence, and with gravity, at the Mass which was said on shore, a remark that Alvarez Cabral had already made. The coast of Brazil. The coast of Brazil. After remaining 13 days in this place, the squadron continued its route to the south, coasting along the shore, and arrived at 34 degrees 40 of south latitude in a country where flowed a large river of fresh water. It was the La Plata. The natives, called Chariuas, were so frightened at the sight of the vessels that they hastily took refuge in the interior of the country, carrying with them all their valuables, and it was impossible to overtake any of them. It was in this country that 4 years previously Juan Diaz de Solis had been massacred by a tribe of Chariuas, armed with that terrible engine which is still in use at the present day among the gauchos of the Argentine Republic, the boluses, which are metal balls fastened to the 2 ends of a long leather thong, called a lasso. A little below the estuary of the La Plata, once thought to be an arm of the sea opening into the Pacific, the flotilla anchored at Port Desire. Here they obtained an ample supply of penguins for the crews of the 5 vessels, a bird which did not make a very delicious meal. Then they anchored in 49 degrees 30 in a beautiful harbor, where Magellan resolved to winter, and which received the name of St. Julian's Bay. The Spaniards had been 2 months there, when one day they perceived a man who seemed to them to be of gigantic stature. At sight of them, he began dancing and singing and throwing dust upon his head. This was a Patagonian, who allowed himself without resistance to be taken on board the vessels. He showed the greatest surprise at all he saw around him, but nothing astonished him so much as a large steel mirror which was presented to him. The giant, who had not the least idea of the use of this piece of furniture, and who, no doubt, now saw his own face for the first time, drew back in such terror that he threw to the ground 4 of our people who were behind him. He was taken back on shore loaded with presents, and the kind welcome which he had received induced 18 of his companions, 13 women and 5 men, to come on board. They were tall and had broad faces, painted red except the eyes, which were encircled with yellow. Their hair was whitened with lime. They were wrapped in enormous fur cloaks, and wore those large leather boots from which was given to them the name of large feet or Patagonians. Their stature was not, however, so gigantic as it appeared to our simple narrator, for it varies froft, 10 in, to 5 ft, 8 in, being somewhat above the middle height among Europeans. For arms they had a short massive bow and arrows made of reed, of which the point was formed of a sharp pebble. The captain, to retain 2 of these savages whom he wished to take to Europe, used a stratagem, which we should characterize as hateful in the present day, but which had nothing revolting about it for the 16th century, when Indians and Negroes were universally considered to be a kind of brute beasts. Magellan loaded these Indians with presents, and when he saw them embarrassed with the quantity, he offered to each of them one of those iron rings used for chaining captives. They would have desired to carry them away, for they valued iron above everything, but their hands were full. It was then proposed to fasten the rings to their legs, to which they agreed without suspicion. The sailors then closed the rings, so that the savages found themselves in fetters. Nothing can give an idea of their fury when they discovered this stratagem, worthy rather of savages than of civilized men. The capture of others was attempted, but in vain, and in the chase one of the Spaniards was wounded by a poisoned arrow, which caused his death almost instantaneously. Intrepid hunters, these people wander about perpetually in pursuit of guanaquis and other game. They are endowed with such wonderful voracity that what would suffice for the nourishment of 20 sailors can scarcely satisfy 7 or 8 of them. Magellan, foreseeing that the stay here was likely to be prolonged, and perceiving that the country only presented meager resources, gave orders to economize the provisions, and to put the men on fixed rations, that they might not experience too great privations before the spring, when they might reach a country where there was more game. But the Spaniards, discontented at the sterility of the place, and at the length and rigor of the winter, began to murmur. This land seemed to stretch southwards as far as the Antarctic pole, they said. There did not seem to be any strait. Already several had died from the privations they had endured. Lastly, it was time to return to Spain, if the commander did not wish to see all his men perish in this place. Magellan, fully resolved to die, or else to bring the enterprise he commanded to a successful issue, replied that the emperor had assigned him the course which the voyage was to take, and he neither could nor would depart from it under any pretext, and that in consequence he should go straight forward to the end of this land, or until he met with some strait. As to provisions, if they found them insufficient, his men might add to their rations the produce of their fishing or hunting. Magellan thought that so firm a declaration would impose silence on the malcontents, and that he would hear no more of privations, from which he suffered equally with his crews. He deceived himself completely. Certain of the captains, and Juan de Carthagena in particular, were interested in causing a revolt to break out. These rebels, therefore, began by reminding the Spaniards of their old animosity against the Portuguese. The captain general, being one of the latter nation, had never, according to them, tendered a wholehearted allegiance to the Spanish flag. In order to be able to return to his own country and to gain pardon for what he had done wrong, he wished to commit some heinous crime, and nothing could be more advantageous to Portugal than the destruction of this fine fleet. Instead of leading them to the archipelago of the Moluccas, of the riches of which he had boasted to them, he wished to take them into frozen regions, the dwelling place of eternal snow, where he could easily manage that they should all perish. Then, with the help of the Portuguese on board the squadron, he would take back to his own country the vessels which he had seized. Such were the reports and accusations that the partisans of Juan de Carthagena, Luis de Mendoza, and Gaspar de Quesada had disseminated among the sailors, when on Palm Sunday, the 1st of April, 1520, Magellan summoned the captains, officers, and pilots to hear mass on board his vessel and to dine with him afterwards. Alvaro de la Mesquita, a cousin of the captain general, accepted this invitation with Antonio de Coca and his officers, but neither Mendoza nor Quesada, nor Juan de Carthagena, who was Quesada's prisoner, appeared. The next night the malcontents boarded the Sunt, Antonio with 30 of the men of the Conception, and desired to have La Mesquita given up to them. The pilot, Juan de Iliorraga, while defending his captain, received 4 stabs from a poniard in the arm. Quesada cried out at the same time, "You will see that this fool will make our business fail." The 3 vessels, the Conception, Sant Antonio, and Santiago, fell without difficulty into the hands of the rebels, who reckoned more than one accomplice among the crews. In spite of this success, the 3 captains did not dare openly to attack the commander-in-chief, and sent to him some proposals for a reconciliation. Magellan ordered them to come on board the Trinidad to confer with him, but this they stoutly refused to do, whereupon Magellan, having no further need of caution, had the boat seized which had brought him this answer, and choosing 6 strong and brave men from amongst his crew, he sent them on board the Victoria, under the command of the Alguazil Espinosa. He carried a letter from Magellan to Mendoza, enjoining him to come on board the Trinidad, and when Mendoza smiled in a scornful manner, Espinosa stabbed him in the throat with a poniard, while a sailor struck him on the head with a cutlass. While these events were taking place, another boat, laden with 15 armed men, came alongside the Victoria and took possession of her without any resistance from the sailors, surprised by the rapidity of the action. On the next day, the 3rd of April, the 2 other rebel vessels were taken, not however without bloodshed. Mendoza's body was divided into quarters, while a clerk read in a loud voice the sentence that blasted his memory. 3 days afterwards, Quesada was beheaded and cut in pieces by his own servant, who undertook this sad task to save his own life. As to Cartagena, the high rank which the royal edict had conferred upon him in the expedition saved him from death, but with Gomez de la Reine, the chaplain, he was left behind on the shore, where some months afterwards he was found by Estevam Gomez. 40 sailors convicted of rebellion were pardoned because their services were considered indispensable. After this severe lesson, Magellan might well hope that the mutinous spirit was really subdued. When the temperature became milder, the anchors were weighed. The squadron put to sea on the 24th of August, following the coast and carefully exploring all the gulfs to find that strait which had been so persistently sought. At the level of Cape St. Croix, one of the vessels, the Santiago, was lost on the rocks during a violent gale from the east. Happily, both the men and merchandise on board were saved, and they succeeded also in taking from the wrecked vessel the rigging and appurtenances of the ship, which they divided among the 4 remaining vessels. At last, on the 21st of October, according to Pigafetta, the 27th of November, according to Maximilian Transylvain, the flotilla penetrated by a narrow entrance into a gulf, at the bottom of which a strait opened, which, as they soon saw, passed into the sea to the south. First they called this the Strait of the 11,000 Virgins, because this was the day dedicated to them. On each side of the strait rose high land covered with snow, on which they saw numerous fires, especially to the left, but they were unable to obtain any communication with the natives. The details which Pigafetta and Martin Transylvain have given with regard to the topographical and hydrographical dispositions of this strait are rather vague, and as we shall have to mention it again when we speak of de Bougainville's expedition, we shall not dilate upon it now. After sailing for 22 days across this succession of narrow inlets and arms of the sea, in some places 3 miles wide, in some 12, which extends for a distance of 440 miles, and has received the name of Magellan's Strait, the flotilla emerged upon a sea of immense extent and great depth. The rejoicings were general when at last the sailors found themselves at the long-wished-for end of their efforts. Henceforward, the route was open, and Magellan's clever conjectures were realized. Nothing is more extraordinary than the navigation of Magellan upon this ocean, which he called Pacific, because for 4 months no storm assailed him upon it. The privations endured by the crews during this long space of time were excessive. The biscuit was nothing more than dust mixed with worms, while the water had become bad and gave out an unbearable smell. The sailors were obliged to eat mice and sawdust to prevent themselves from dying of hunger, and to gnaw all the leather that it was possible to find. As it was easy to foresee under these circumstances, the crews were decimated by scurvy. 19 men died, and 30 were seized with violent pains in their arms and legs, which caused prolonged sufferings. At last, after having sailed over more than 12,000 miles without meeting with a single island, in a sea where so many and such populous archipelagos were destined to be discovered, the fleet came upon 2 desert and sterile islands, called for that reason the Unfortunate Islands, but of which the position is indicated in much too contradictory a manner for it to be possible to recognize them. In 12 degrees north latitude and degrees longitude, on Wednesday the 6th of March, the navigators discovered successively 3 islands, at which they greatly desired to stop to recruit and take in fresh provisions. But the islanders who came on board stole so many things without the possibility of preventing them, that the sailors were obliged to give up the idea of remaining there. The natives contrived even to carry off a long boat. Magellan, indignant at such daring, made a descent with 40 armed men, burned some houses and boats, and killed 7 men. These islanders had neither chief, king, nor religion. Their heads were covered with palm leaf hats, they wore beards, and their hair descended to their waists. Generally of an olive tint, they thought they embellished themselves by coloring their teeth black and red, while their bodies were anointed with coconut oil, no doubt in order to protect themselves from the heat of the sun. Their canoes of curious construction carried a very large matting sail, which might have easily capsized the boat if the precaution had not been taken of giving a more stable trim by means of a long piece of wood kept at a certain distance by 2 poles. This is what is called the balance. These islanders were very industrious, but had a singular aptitude for stealing, which has gained for their country the name of the Islands of Thieves, Ladrone Islands. The Ladrone Islands. The Ladrone Islands. From an old print. On the 16th of March was seen, at about 900 miles from the Ladrones, some high ground. This was soon discovered to be an island which now goes by the name of Samar Island. There Magellan, resolving to give his exhausted crews some rest, caused 2 tents to be pitched on land for the use of the sick. The natives quickly brought bananas, palm wine, coconuts, and fish, for which mirrors, combs, bells, and other similar trifles were offered in exchange. The coconut, a tree which is valuable beyond all others, supplied these natives with their bread, wine, oil, and vinegar, and besides they obtained from it their clothing and the necessary wood for building and roofing in their huts. The natives soon became familiar with the Spaniards, and told them that their archipelago produced cloves, cinnamon, pepper, nutmegs, ginger, maize, or Indian corn, and that even gold was found there. Magellan gave this archipelago the name of the St. Lazarus Islands, afterwards changed to that of the Philippines from the name of Philip of Austria, son of Charles V. This archipelago is formed of a great number of islands which extend in Malaysia between 5 degrees 32 and degrees 38 north latitude and degrees 56 and degrees 43 longitude east of the meridian of Paris. The most important are Luzon, Mindoro, Leyte, the Ceylon of Pigafetta, Samar, Panay, Negros, Cebu, Bohol, Palawan, and Mindanao. When they were a little restored, the Spaniards put to sea again in order to explore the archipelago. They saw in succession the islands of Senilo, Huinogan, Ibusan, and Abarian, as well as another island called Masava, of which the King Kalambu could make himself understood by a slave, a native of Sumatra, whom Magellan had taken to Europe from India, and who by his knowledge of Malay rendered signal service in several instances. The king came on board with 6 or 8 of his principal subjects. He brought with him presents for the captain general, and in exchange he received a vest of red and yellow cloth, made in Turkish fashion, and a cap of fine scarlet, while mirrors and knives were given to the members of his suite. The Spaniards showed him all their firearms and fired some shots from the cannon in his presence, at which he was much terrified. Then Magellan caused one of our number to be fully armed, says Pigafetta, and ordered 3 men to give him blows with the sword and stiletto, to show the king that nothing could wound a man armed in this manner, which surprised him greatly. And turning to the interpreter, he said to the captain through him, that a man thus armed could fight against 100. Yes, replied the interpreter, in the name of the commandant, and each of the 3 vessels carries 200 men armed in this manner. The king, astonished by all that he had seen, took leave of the captain, begging him to send 2 of his men with him to let them see something of the island. Pigafetta was chosen, and was much satisfied with the welcome that he received. The king told him that in this island they found pieces of gold as large as nuts, and even eggs, mixed with the earth which they passed through a sieve to find them. All his vessels, and even some of the ornaments of his house, were of this metal. He was very neatly dressed, according to the custom of the country, and was the finest man that I have seen among these people. His black hair fell upon his shoulders, a silk veil covered his head, and he wore 2 rings in his ears. From his waist to his knees, he was covered with a cotton cloth embroidered in silk. On each of his teeth there were 3 spots of gold, arranged in such a manner that one would have said all his teeth were fastened together with this metal. He was perfumed with storax and benzoin. His skin was painted, but its natural tint was olive. On Easter Day, the Europeans went on shore to celebrate Mass in a kind of little church, which they had constructed on the seashore with sails and branches of trees. An altar had been set up, and during the whole time that the religious ceremony lasted, the king, with a large concourse of people, listened in silence and imitated all the motions of the Spaniards. Then a cross having been planted on a hill with great solemnity, they weighed anchor and made for the port of Zebu, as being the best for revictualling the vessels and trading. They arrived there on Sunday, the 7th of April. Magellan sent one of his officers on shore at once with the interpreter as ambassador to the king of Zebu. The envoy explained that the chief of the squadron was under the orders of the greatest king in the world. The object of the voyage, he added, was the wish to pay him a visit, and at the same time to take in some fresh provisions in exchange for merchandise, and then to go to the Molucca Islands. Such were the motives which caused them to tarry in a country where they came as friends. "They are welcome," replied the king, "but if they intend to trade, they should pay a duty to which all vessels are subject that enter my port, as did, not 4 days since, a junk from Siam, which came to seek for slaves and gold, to which a Moorish merchant who has remained in this country can testify." The Spaniard replied that his master was too great a king to submit to such an unreasonable demand. They had come with pacific intentions, but if war were declared, it would be seen with whom they had to deal. The king of Zebu, warned by the Moorish merchant of the power of those who stood before him, and whom he took for Portuguese, at length consented to forego his claims. Moreover, the king of Massava, who had continued to serve as pilot to the Spaniards, so altered the inclinations of his brother sovereign, that the Spaniards obtained the exclusive privilege of trading in the island, and a loyal friendship was sealed between the king of Zebu and Magellan by an exchange of blood which each drew from his right arm. From this moment, provisions were brought and cordial relations established. The nephew of the king came with a numerous suite to visit Magellan on board his ship, and the latter took this opportunity to relate to his visitors the wonderful history of the creation of the world and of the redemption of the human race, and to invite him and his people to become converts to Christianity. They showed no repugnance to being baptized, and on the 14th of April, the kings of Zebu and Massava and the Moorish merchant, with 500 men and as many women, received baptism. But what was only a fashion at first, for it cannot be said that the natives knew the religion which they embraced or were persuaded of its truth, became a real frenzy after a wonderful cure had been effected by Magellan. Having learnt that the father of the king had been ill for 2 years and was on the point of death, the captain general promised that if he consented to be baptized and the natives would burn their idols, he would find himself cured. He added that he was so convinced of what he said, relates Pigafetta, for it is as well to quote the author verbatim in such a matter, that he agreed to lose his head if what he promised did not happen immediately. We then made a procession, with all possible pomp, from the place where we were to the sick man's house, whom we found really in a very sad state, in that he could neither speak nor move. We baptized him with 2 of his wives and 10 daughters. The captain asked him directly after his baptism how he found himself, and he suddenly replied that thanks to our Lord he was well. We were all witnesses of this miracle. The captain above all rendered thanks to God for it. He gave the prince a refreshing drink, and continued to send him some of it every day till he was quite restored. On the 5th day, the invalid found himself quite cured and got up. His first care was to have burned, in the presence of the king and all the people, an idol for which he had great veneration, and which some old women guarded carefully in his house. He also caused some temples which stood on the seashore, and in which the people assembled to eat the meat consecrated to their old divinities, to be thrown down. All the inhabitants applauded these acts, and proposed themselves to go and destroy all the idols, even those which were in use in the king's house, crying at the same time, "Vive la Castile," in honor of the King of Spain. Near to the island of Zebu is another island called Matin, which had 2 chiefs, one of whom had recognized the authority of Spain, while the other having energetically resisted it, Magellan resolved to impose it upon him by force. On Friday, the 26th of April, 3 long boats left for the island of Matin, containing 60 men wearing cuirasses and helmets, and armed with muskets, and 30 balangays bearing the king of Zebu, his son-in-law, and a number of warriors. The Spaniards waited for day, and then to the number of 49 leapt into the water, for the boats could not approach the land on account of the rocks and shallow water. More than 1,500 natives awaited them, and at once threw themselves upon them and attacked them in 3 troops, both in front and flank. The musketeers and the crossbowmen fired on the multitude of warriors from a distance, without doing them much harm, they being protected by their bucklers. The Spaniards, assailed by stones, arrows, javelins, and lances, and overwhelmed by numbers, set fire to some huts to disperse and intimidate the natives. But these, made more furious by the sight of the fire, redoubled their efforts, and pressed the Spaniards on all sides, who had the greatest difficulty in resisting them, when a sad event took place which compromised the issue of the combat. The natives were not slow in remarking that all the blows which they directed towards those parts of their enemies' bodies which were protected by armor caused no wounds. They set themselves therefore to hurl their arrows and javelins against the lower part of the body, which was undefended. Magellan, wounded in the leg by a poisoned arrow, gave the order for retreat, which, begun in good order, soon changed into such a flight that 7 or 8 Spaniards alone remained at his side. With much difficulty, they kept moving backwards, fighting as they went, in order to reach the boats. They were already knee-deep in the water when several islanders rushed all together upon Magellan, who, wounded in the arm, was unable to draw his sword. They gave him such a saber cut upon his leg that he immediately fell down in the water, where he was speedily dispatched. His remaining companions, and among them Pigafetta, every one of whom had been hit, hastily regained the boats. Thus perished the illustrious Magellan on the 27th of April, 1521. He was adorned with every virtue, says Pigafetta, and ever exhibited an unshaken constancy in the midst of the greatest adversity. At sea, he always condemned himself to greater privations than the rest of his crew. Better versed than anyone else in the knowledge of nautical charts, he was perfect in the art of navigation, as he proved by making the tour of the world, which none before him had ventured to do. Pigafetta's funeral eulogy, though a little hyperbolical, is not untrue in the main. Magellan had need of singular constancy and perseverance to penetrate, despite the fears of his companions, into regions peopled by the superstitious spirit of the time with fantastic dangers. Peculiar nautical science was also necessary to achieve the discovery at the extremity of that long coast of the strait, which so justly bears his name. He was obliged to give unceasing attention to avoid all untoward accidents while exploring those unknown parts without any exact instruments. That one of the vessels was lost must be imputed to pride and a spirit of revolt in her own captain, more than to any incapacity or want of caution in the captain general. Let us add with our enthusiastic narrator, the glory of Magellan will survive his death. Death of Magellan.